What kind of world do I want to live in? I think about this question a lot.
For our generation and for specifically my group of people, which is refugees, the circumstances might dismantle any vision of the future that we have.
You're trying to rebuild, you're trying to make a future for yourself, and then the climate-related disaster comes and you start again. It's not about how it's affecting you now, it's about how it's affecting you your entire life.
First step to understand is that we're all a part of it. None of us are going to be left out by the crisis.
We're at a stage where if we don't act now, really there won't be very much left.
There are generations that will never see certain things that we grew up seeing in real life.
We have to start treating this like the emergency it is. To achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, we have to go from an intention to a serious commitment.
Business leaders really need to rethink how they conduct their business and invest in creating systems that are climate friendly.
The action I would like to see is accountability. Structures being put in place where countries aren't just asked to do something, but they're kept accountable to the decisions that they make.
There has to be that strong collaboration between government, between corporations, between youth activists to drive change forward.
The world I would want to live in is a world where imagining the future is not a privilege.
I want to live in a world where people do not give up on hope that a positive change is possible.
The fact that you're listening today means that you are willing to make a change.
Hello, I'm Ed Conway. I'm Economics and Data Editor at Sky News. Welcome to this session on From Innovation to Immunity, Creating the Markets of Tomorrow. And obviously there are a few people who could try to claim that the pandemic that we've been through and the experience of the past 18 months has been especially positive. It's been a difficult testing time, both for many families and governments and companies around the world. But by the same token, I suppose one question is, what kind of lessons can we learn for the way that the world is run, the way that globalization functions, the way that supply chains function? What can we learn in particular about the vaccine development process? What can we learn about how that changes our innovation policies, intellectual property protection, new market creation as well? What worked well, what flaws became apparent that we can learn from in the process? This is a very brief issue briefing. It's only half an hour, so we don't have all that long, but we're going to whiz through some of those questions with an excellent panel here. Professor Frank Giels, Professor of System Innovation at University of Manchester, Tanya Holt, Senior Partner, Global Leader of McKinsey's Public and Social Sector Practice, Her Excellency Beata Habyarimana, Minister of Trade and Industry of Rwanda, Dr. Seth Berkley, CEO of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. They're all here, and we will be talking over the course of the next half hour. Now, as I say, it's relatively brief. We don't have time for questions. What we do have time for are a couple of survey questions, which you will be able to answer on Slido. So hopefully you will see a link coming up. If you've joined via Top Link, you'll see a link coming up on your Zoom with the details of how to answer these questions. And so a couple of questions, we'll take you'll be able to answer them over the course of this session as we talk, and then we'll look at the answers towards the end. So the first question, let's just ask that first question as we go to the first part of this discussion, looking at that transition from health to the climate crisis and what we deal with, how we deal with that. Question on Slido. To what extent are the learnings from COVID-19 vaccine development and rollout applicable to the creation of new markets necessary for the green transition? There you can see you can answer it to a very small extent all the way through to a very large extent, or indeed I don't know. So have a think about that as we go through with this part of our discussion, and then we'll have a look at the answers towards the end and perhaps comment on them. First of all, I want to ask Frank Giels just to kick this off. So the production, the development, the distribution of the vaccine, it's been one of this kind of unique examples of the creation of a new market from scratch, and obviously new supply chains. We're looking at the way that they function at the moment, and many of them have functioned very well. Some question marks as well, of course. But what lessons have we learned from the process, and what kind of new markets could they be more urgently applied to, perhaps?
Well, thanks, Ed. That's an excellent question. I think the link between the vaccine development and the climate crisis is, of course, the interest in speed and acceleration. And the COVID vaccine is an example where speed is exceptional. It's never happened in the history of medicine so quick. And of course, we need that kind of speed in climate, where it presently is absent. It's not going fast enough to meet the climate targets. I think that's the link between the two, at least the point that I want to make. So what we can learn from the COVID crisis or the vaccine development is, first of all, that governments can accelerate innovation. Sometimes it's ideas just about the markets, but the government in this case really threw lots of money at it, 13 billion in the US through Operation Warp Speed, all across the innovation chain, from R&D to pilots to upscaling to manufacturing, all the way to guaranteed markets, basically, through the purchase agreements. So governments can accelerate. Companies can move very fast if they want to. If they have guaranteed markets, there is low risk, there are attractive incentives by the government, they're willing and they can go fast. We also learn consumers are willing to change. They can adopt, they're willing to change their behavior to get the vaccine shots. If it's simple, it's low cost, they didn't have to pay for it, it's free in most countries. It's a limited effort, so that you get a COVID jab twice in your arm, and it's a clear personal benefit that can save your life. So that's what we can learn. Unfortunately, some of these conditionalities, which I just specified, don't immediately translate to climate. So there is far less agreement. Okay, we know the problem. We know we want to go low carbon, but which pathway? There's a lot of disagreements. In heat, do we want to go for heat pumps? Do we want to go for district heater and hydrogen? There's far less agreement. So therefore, governments are pushing less hard. Incumbent companies also have a lot of vested interests, whereas in the COVID, they more or less agree they want to move fast. But with the climate crisis, a lot of the big oil, the utilities, the car companies, they've got vested interests. They don't want to change. They want to go slow. And on the consumer side as well, it's not as simple as getting a COVID jab where you have to install a heat pump, insulate your house, buy an electric vehicle. It's much more complicated. So some of the lessons they're quite different problems in some ways.
Minister, I want to ask you as well. People have talked about Rwanda as being a potential location for the creation of an African COVID vaccine hub. So from the perspective of an emerging economy and thinking of beyond vaccines in particular, more broadly to other markets of tomorrow, whether it's kind of green technologies, whether it's ed tech, things like that, what are the main impediments that a country like Rwanda faces when it's developing kind of local productive capacity? And what strategy are you following in particular?
Just not seen in the light of the pandemic, but rather in the meaning of it is inclusive sustainable development. In terms of impediment, I would just first highlight like 4. The first one is a legal framework where we can see impediments in intellectual property, where we are trying to increase companies to come, and we need to have them ensured that the patent and the intellectual property will be protected and respected. We have the revised IP law in Rwanda, also, which is being extending the patent cooperation, and this is able to maintain some flexibility with the TRIPS agreement and the WHO. But we have also Rwanda it is needed that we ensure that we are going to be compliant with international standards, and currently our Food and Drug Authority is undergoing an assessment to reach the WHO mandatory maturity level 3. So I think that one would be the legal impediment, but the other one is the technical and educational capacity. It means investing in skills development, retooling, upskilling, reskilling, and this is really much needed. And as a country, I've been investing in a research lab, creating a national industrial research agency, and also creating a national science and technology agency. And at the same time, we try to attract some education of world-class educational institutions like Carnegie Mellon to inspire the next generation. A third impediment I would just highlight would be the infrastructure, which is, of course, an important element. I mean, telecommunication networks, data centers, and payment gateways. These are needed for an innovative business. But for Rwanda, like for instance, we have been investing in 4G, in data centers, in good road network, and in airways links. And we want to create a country where it is a gateway for innovation. And as a flagship project, I will just share the Kigali Innovation City, which aims to supplement this infrastructure by creating a community of learning and exchange between institutions of higher learning level, R&D labs, research facilities, entrepreneurs and ventures capitalists. And the last one, but still the most important also, is the capital, because it is needed to develop our local productive capacities. I mean capital investment. And for this, I mean public and private sector capital is critical. And this, for us, is linked to the establishment of the Kigali International Financial Center. We believe through this center, we can achieve by leveraging on the ready and eager capital, looking for positive and above market return on investment, especially in emerging countries. So we think that the 4 impediments we share with us as numbers for one. Thank you.
Okay. Minister, I don't know, I think there might be something scratching on your microphone, so it seems to be kind of coming in and out. So just, I don't know if there's anything that you can sort out with your microphone there, but thank you very much for those comments. I wonder, Frank Giels, if I could ask you, I mean, you know, we're in a situation at the moment where energy prices are very high at the moment. You talked about the difficulty of comparing this to you know, the ease of going and getting a vaccine. For a lot of people, it's a very sensitive and very difficult thing dealing with high energy prices. You know, are there lessons from that for people's kind of tolerance or enthusiasm or the ease of getting them to invest in this transition across the world?
Yeah, there are, of course, lessons also from the past. The oil shocks in the past did stimulate companies to start investing in R&D in the 70s, the 73 and 79. But it's not so easy for both companies and consumers to switch, because, you know, once you have a car, a petrol car, yeah, the prices can go up, but you can't immediately switch to somewhere else, go live somewhere else. The same when you've got a gas boiler in your house. Well, the gas prices go up, you just have to pay more. There's very little you can do. So there's all kind of lock-ins. So contrary to economic theory, there are, you know, the price elasticity is sometimes very low. The price can go up, but we don't have options to shift. So that's why there are all kind of complaints, and policymakers are trying to, you know, lower the price. That's also why it's quite sensitive to introduce a carbon price, which maybe ultimately we would need to go green. But that will only work if people are offered alternatives at a feasible price, and if they can shift. And this is where the government can help. These are some of the lessons we learned from COVID. The government can provide huge subsidies throughout the whole innovation chain, make it easier to shift, and also help build a distribution chain.
Minister, can I ask, for Rwanda, having you know, already being facing COVID-19, as many African nations have, has that diminished the enthusiasm to deal with other issues like climate change and the green transition?
No, I think it goes all along, and there's no diminution of it, because in the same time, when you look at it, it is involved in the inclusive sustainable development. So it goes along because in the whole sense is manufacturing we're pushing together, and as well as the green industrialization.
Okay, that is interesting, and I wonder, just generally, either of you or indeed any of the panel, to some extent, what we've seen over the course of the past year is, you know, a challenge of globalization to some extent, a challenge of supply chains. These have been tested in a way that we haven't really seen for quite some time, perhaps even more than in the financial crisis. So does that beg questions, you know, given that, well, climate change is yet another one of those issues that you need to deal with multilaterally. Does that beg questions about our ability as a world, as a set of nations, as a set of companies to confront it?
If I might, A couple of issues that I think are important here. First of all, both of these are about having truth and knowledge and beliefs that people have. I mean, if you want to take a vaccine, you have to believe it's safe. You have to believe it's efficacious. You have to believe that it's not having bad things injected into you, which certainly has been some of the rumors. And on climate change, you have to believe that this is also good, that it's something you want to do. Frank's already talked about some of the additional costs. And I think this is one of the challenges we have, because we live in a world where information flow isn't necessarily linked to truth. And so, from my perspective, one of the challenges we had with vaccines was we started out saying this is a viral pandemic that spread like lightning across the world. We need to make sure that everybody gets vaccines, because nobody is safe unless everyone's safe. And what we saw instead was behavior that said, I'm worried about my community, my country. And in some countries, it is easy to get vaccines, as Frank has said, but in many others, it hasn't been. And yet we've seen the effects of that, new variants appearing, spreading around the world. So I think from my perspective, it's about getting also collective beliefs, understanding the global commons, and getting people to invest in that is kind of a characteristic necessary for success here.
Okay, well, hold that thought, because I want to go on to the second question that we've got on Slido, which you'll see coming up in just a moment. And then we'll come back to that issue at the end. So this is the next question. Currently, less than 2% of the population of low-income economies have received their first COVID vaccine dose. To what extent do you think that current IP regimes are preventing a timely rollout of vaccines in emerging economies? It's clearly a hot topic, as is, of course, the questions of what's going on with supply chains and how more of these vaccines can be delivered. So if I could go to you, Tanya, first of all, talking more broadly about that manufacturing question. You've worked a lot in Africa, particularly the health sector. I just want to know, how important is it for Africa to be able to manufacture their own vaccines locally? And what's that going to take to actually make that happen?
Yeah, I mean, building on the comment from Seth before, I think first and foremost, we have to remember that we are still very much finding ourselves in a humanitarian crisis. There's many of us that have family members, friends who don't have access to the vaccine yet. And so we're very much in a situation of have and have-nots in terms of who can transition into sort of, let's say, a new normal. But frankly, also who can travel freely across the world, and therefore also the ability of the countries to transition into an economic recovery. Having said that, and when we talk about the markets of tomorrow, it's important. It's difficult to talk about that without talking, of course, about the vaccine development and the vaccine manufacturing markets. And again, here, I think it's important that we take both the short-term view on what's happening currently during the pandemic, but also as you think about the markets of the future. We have more than 9 million children who are unimmunized in much of the low and middle income countries. So this isn't just about creating vaccine manufacturing for the COVID pandemic. It's also creating the vaccine manufacturing capacity and the delivery to those children who are not receiving the vaccine today. You know, a couple of facts on this point. Pre-COVID, we had in Africa 99% of the volumes being imported into the continent, despite Africa consuming of the public market 25% of the volumes of the global market. And of course, that raises questions, in particular when we've seen over the last couple of decades that other emerging markets like India and China have been able to develop their industry. So why can't Africa do the same? And I think many leaders in Africa and globally are currently asking that questions. And we're seeing African Union under the Africa CDC putting out very clear targets that they have an aspiration by 2040 to produce 60% of the vaccines locally. 60% of the vaccines locally correspond to, depending on what you believe about the demand, it's roughly 1.3 to 1.5 billion doses. And that's a huge step up from what we have today, where we perhaps have less than 10 vaccine manufacturers on the continent. So I think the question is not if, the question is how. How do we create sustainable markets for these manufacturers and fund the country so that we don't end up having white elephants? Nobody's interested in that. And secondly, how do we do it in a smart manner? As I'm sure Seth will comment on, we've seen unbelievable advancement in both the vaccine development, but also in the manufacturing. It was, unimaginable to see tech transfer in less than 6 months, and that's currently what's happening. So as we build up this manufacturing capacity in Africa, how do we do it in a smart manner? How do we leverage all the technology, all the innovations to do it as smart as possible?
That's fascinating. And actually that kind of brings us to that question that we posed with Slido at the start about IP. I mean, Seth, actually, I want to ask you that because it's a burning issue. How big of a deal is that, the IP and the extent to which it could be more freely shared? Could that solve everything? Is that the kind of silver bullet we've been looking towards? Are there other solutions that we should be focusing on more at the moment?
So it's interesting. Biologics are different than small molecules. And small molecules, patents are critical, and you can manufacture them anywhere. That's the whole idea of generics. For vaccines, they're basically living things. And so what you have to do is do the process and get that right. And about 70% of vaccine manufacturing actually are the controls in the process and the assays and work that's done on that. So patents alone don't help you. Obviously, they can be a barrier, but what you need is know-how transfers. And so what we need are incentives in place to have companies work with other companies and transfer that technology, and the obviously, if there are associated patents in the way to work for, to move forward. So what the minister said from Rwanda is exactly right. They're trying to create a conducive environment for doing that. And let me give you a technical example. We worked with Rwanda to transfer a technology to do drone deliveries. Rwanda did it brilliantly. They did it because they had well-trained people. They had infrastructure. They started out using it for blood, but then it shifted to other things. And then when this happened, it shifted over to Ghana, and Ghana's delivered, 2.5 million doses of COVID vaccines using drones that were first tried in Rwanda. And I think that type of technological leap can occur. I think the challenge for vaccines has been it takes a very long investment because you have to build the regulatory agencies, the laboratories, the control systems, and then you've got to test them. And of course, the first vaccine that rolls out won't be cost effective. It's not going to be at the volumes you see in large manufacturers. So it needs subsidies for a period of time. But Africa should and must. And for Gavi, we're the largest purchaser of vaccines in the world. We buy vaccines for more than 50% of the world's kids. And, we already buy from the African continent. We buy yellow fever vaccines. And we've shifted over time from 5 manufacturers initially, most in the developed world, now to 17, most in developing countries. So this is doable and important for the economics of the world.
And that point that you made about, the extent to which it's actually, it's IP versus, and patents versus actually, having those supply chains. Does that goes for all of the vaccines? Does it? It goes for the kind of AstraZeneca vaccine as well as for those mRNA vaccines?
It may be a little bit less for the mRNA vaccines, but 180 steps into making those mRNA vaccines, new technologies, purity required, et cetera. So I think it may be they're a little bit more like a chemical than is the old-fashioned vaccines. And maybe this will be the innovation that will change things. Certainly, you can make vaccines much, much quicker. It was 42 days after the genome was published to the first vaccine in a vial, 63 days into the trial, which previous history for licensed vaccines, this was 327 days. Previous history was 4 years. So that science and that work is changing.
Okay, Minister, I wonder, Minister, if I could ask you about that point that Tanya Holt made about the extent to which Africa is reliant on imports for so many of these critical goods. When you kind of hear statistics like that about African nations not having that degree of manufacturing capacity or production, that must frustrate you enormously, does it?
It does, but at the same time, I think it gives some kind of hope because this pandemic period have been able to show to the whole world how the situation is, the reality of what is happening. And I think it also created a kind of aura of where everybody wants to have his foot on it. So I think it has its bad side, but it also has its good side, because it has been able to push some countries to start thinking concretely how to operate and how to put it in place. Manufacturing has been at a very low level, but today, with all the initiatives, we think that it will be like a beginning. Of course, it goes through a global value chain. It is not something to discuss at the level of a domestic chain, but rather at the regional and global value chain, everyone taking its part on the steps and the processes. And I think it's also very important to have the way the tech transfers, the knowledge is transferred, but still it is also intended to a sustainable development for all. As long as we still have some countries not being covered, and it will be affecting the whole global chain. I think it's something important to highlight.
Okay, that's fascinating. Well, I tell you what, let's look at the results of the polls that we've had so far, and then perhaps we can have a brief discussion about them. So we've got two polls. I guess we can see the result perhaps of the first one. I'm hoping that we can. And that, of course, was the poll about to what extent are the learnings from COVID vaccine development and rollout applicable to the creation of new markets. Although I don't actually see that coming up. Has that come up? There it is. Sorry, I need to look at mine. So it is to a large extent. So 63% say to a large extent those learnings are applicable to the creation of new markets necessary for the green transition. I want to get Frank's take on that, because there's a decent amount of optimism there that we can take some of this and move it on and use that when it comes to climate change and the green transition and renewable energy. There's an optimistic audience.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear the optimism. The question, of course, was quite open, framed in quite an open way. So I'm not entirely clear what the audience thinks precisely, but I think maybe there's wide agreement that governments can accelerate, and this is beginning to change also in the climate. That is not just a carbon tax, not just external, but actually they can advance innovation through the innovation chain, not just through R&D as well, but also the piloting, the creation of the market, guaranteed markets, pricing. I think maybe, and the idea that companies, can move fast if they're sufficiently incentivized. I think those are the two lessons. But I am still cautious about what we can generalize more precisely, because there are also quite substantial differences.
Challenges, certainly. Okay, well, let's look at the other question that we asked on Slido. Thank you for your answers on that. We've got a draw here, it looks like. Currently, less than 2% of the population of low-income countries received their COVID vaccine doses, their first doses. To what extent do you think current IP regimes are preventing a timely rollout? Well, it's somewhat, or to a large extent. I don't know what we can draw into that, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, a draw. What do we think about that, Seth? I mean, you were a little bit skeptical about that. Where would you have voted on that one? Somewhat, maybe, or even less than that?
I personally think it's a red herring. I think the critical issue here is having the will and the desire to do it, and then to make the plans to do it, to build the capacity, and then to find the right partner. I was on the phone earlier with a manufacturer very interested to do this, that has capabilities, and up until now they haven't been particularly in biologics. They are now incentivized, as the minister said, and so now they really want to do it. And now it's finding the right technology to do that tech transfer. And by the way, there's been a shortage, as Tanya said, of tech transfer going forward, partially because, we're trying to scale up from what used to be about 3.5 to 4 billion doses a year to this year, maybe, 12 to 15 of the COVID vaccines on top of the routine vaccines we still have to make and make sure we're prepared against diseases. So I think this idea of having a more diversity of manufacturers is great, but we also don't want to get into having only regional hubs. We want an open system that technologies can move, ideas can move, and I think that's what's going to be important going forward.
I mean, Tanya, what's your response to that? Because obviously, you talked about tech transfer. There's certain elements that one can be kind of quite encouraged about, but this has been an enormously challenging year, and we're still in it right now. So what are the lessons when it comes to tech transfer? And I mean, I don't know. Were you surprised by the result of that poll? Probably not. So no one can quite make their mind up about that one.
Well, I think as the minister was saying, I think this pandemic has really shed light on inequality and in terms of access to vaccine broadly, and also in terms of the perhaps lack of diversification of our global supply network. So when we look at the past 20 years, we had less than 10 tech transfers going from, let's call it, the north to the south, and in the last 18 months, we are looking at almost 10 tech transfers, right? So we just seen a speed up in terms of the kind of collaboration that we need to see to really start addressing this. So I'm quite optimistic. And having said that, I think, there's a long way to go in terms of building up the ecosystem. And this is really where we do need to see both the international community and the African countries themselves making the sufficient investments. Currently, when you look at an average, let's call it vaccine company in Africa, sort of less than 10% of that workforce is sitting within R&D. When you compare that to a multinational, they have between 20 and 30%. So there's plenty of investments we need to see. We see great strife in terms of setting up a harmonized regulatory agency with the African Medicine Agency, the AMA, that was just ratified. We need to see that coming into place as soon as possible. It will make it easier for the manufacturers who are on the continent to produce, to export, and have healthy, sustainable markets. So I'm an optimist. I think we have all the prerequisites there in terms of leadership currently. And so we need to build on that momentum and make this prerequisite investments into the broader ecosystem.
Okay, Tanya, thank you very much indeed. Well, I think we've more or less come to the end of the time in this session. Really interesting kind of trot through so many of these issues. I want to thank all of the panelists for their contributions, and thank you everyone for contributing to those surveys. I don't know if we've necessarily answered anything on them, but certainly we've kind of piqued people's curiosity perhaps about them. So that was From Innovation to Immunity, Creating the Markets of Tomorrow. We certainly have lots of burning questions, which I'm sure we can take on to the rest of this event, about the extent to which those lessons from COVID can be extrapolated, both when it comes to solving the climate crisis and when it comes to resolving manufacturing supply chains in all parts of the world, including, of course, in Africa. So thank you very much for listening to this session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.